Hey everyone, and welcome to OpenWest. I'm very excited to be your keynote speaker this morning, or one of two. Looking forward to hearing what Kyle has to tell us later. You know what? A pro tip for speaking is to have a note that says start your timer, so you don't forget to start your timer, which I have just done. All right, hello. So, as Victor said, I am VM Brasseur, but because we're all friends here, you can call me Vicky. Plus, the virtual machine jokes have gotten old. Please don't think yours is original, it's probably not. I am an open source policy and strategy freelancer. I am an author and community moderator for opensource.com. I am the vice president of the Open Source Initiative and the author of this, the very first book all about how to contribute to open source. It's available now at that URL in beta. Here's my contact information. I strongly encourage you to use it. So hi, I am Vicky Brasseur, and I love free and open source software. And so do all of you, really, or else you probably wouldn't be here today. But what is it that we love? So free and open source software has been around for nearly 40 years. Can you imagine that? 40 years now. In 1986, Richard Stallman founded the FSF to support the 4 freedoms that you see here on the screen, where you can run the program, study it, redistribute, modify however you want. A lot of us, we live our lives in pursuit and protection of these 4 freedoms. I call this period of history FOSS 1.0, Free and Open Source Software 1.0, and this is the initial version of the movement. It's where it all began. In 1998, 20 years ago, the term open source was brought into common usage, and it was codified here in the open source definition. The definition expands upon the concepts set forth in the 4 freedoms, and it includes more criteria for open source, many of which are related to licensing and making sure that the software remains open and available for all. This definition is maintained by us at the Open Source Initiative, and it provides focus and direction to the entire open source movement. And yes, it is 20 years old this very year. This means this is our 20th anniversary of the term open source and of the Open Source Initiative. So happy birthday, open source. If you want stickers, yes, we can applaud at that, because 20 years. If you want OSI stickers, open source stickers, and even a special limited edition 20th anniversary sticker, come and find me around the event, and I'm very happy to hand those out to you. Now, what follows from this point on is version 2.0 of free and open source software. It evolved, and it just kept right on evolving as it gained more mind share and more users. The 4 freedoms and the open source definition, these are very, very much focused around code and software. But really, we know that open source is so much more than just code. It's about the philosophy of sharing. For as long as there's been software, we have been sharing software. But when Stallman created the 4 freedoms, he codified a belief that sharing is a fundamental and an ethical priority in software development. This sharing is about believing that giants exist and we stand on their shoulders, and that one day we get to be those giants and lift up the people who come after us. But it's about more than simply sharing, right? You can put your code out there, and that's one thing, but it doesn't evolve all on its own. So free and open source, it's about collaboration, working with others to make the improvements needed to create the tools that we use every single day. Free and open source is about coming together to make something bigger and better than any of us could do alone. Which means that free and open source software is about people. People doing things alongside people to help other people. Right? Without the people, really, there's no need for software. Who would use it? Without the efforts of those people, there would be no software to help others. So people are the core of free and open source software. What you see on the screen here, this is the motto of the Humane Development Movement. Humane development is not specifically about open source, but this motto perfectly captures the spirit of free and open source software. We are humans working with humans to develop software for the benefit of humans. Free and open source has come to stand for so much more than originally intended. It's got community and collaboration and coming together to build and support resources that improve lives in ways both small and large and that empower and enable other people. And then there is this powerful yet tiny little word, open. While free and open source is all about the source, the code, right? It's underpinned by this concept of openness, of honesty, of sharing, and openness transcends code and software. It's not a new concept. I mean, duh, openness is definitely not a new concept. As I mentioned, we've been sharing software for as long as we've been writing it. And of course, sharing itself is older than civilization. But with the coming of the free and open source software movements, the concept of openness has been recognized, it's been codified, evangelized, and embraced in so many ways beyond simply source code. We have open data, and that allows information to be used by everyone. All kinds of information is now being made open. You've got map data and weather data and data about trees and data about resource expenditures and usage and, jaguars, whatever you want. There's open data out there about it. And it's being released by cities and countries and researchers, and they're all making their data publicly available for use and reuse. For example, every year, the governments of Australia and New Zealand run something called GovHack. Over 1,000 people get together. They participate and they collaborate. And they create free and open source apps and tools. But each one of those tools is designed around an open data set. And specifically, the tool is to make that data set more accessible to even more people in their countries. Relatedly, we have open government. Open government enables citizen oversight over our elected officials. Organizations and groups like the Sunlight Foundation, they use a multidisciplinary approach to further the transparency and accountability of governments and the representatives who comprise them. And we have open access to research and knowledge through open journals. Access to these materials and this information and this knowledge, it's protected by scholars and librarians all over the world, including those at organizations like the Internet Archive, who make it their mission to improve access to the world's information. Internet Archive is so much more than just the Wayback Machine. Its mission, its core mission, is universal access to all knowledge. It has millions and millions of books and videos and images and audio files and video games and emulated software, right? And it's constantly looking for new ways to make this information available and open to everyone in the world. The concept of openness has even spread outside of information into the real world, in places such as the Open Seeds movement, which is very specifically and explicitly modeled on free and open source software. It guarantees that farmers can get, plant, and crossbreed and share seeds that are not encumbered by genetic patents. So we have won. Free and open source software and openness, it's won. Openness is gaining momentum and it is spreading like a wildfire across the entire world. In August 2011, Marc Andreessen had an article in the Wall Street Journal. In this article, he describes how business has become reliant upon software. And even hardware is simply a medium through which software can operate in many cases. If a modern company wishes to succeed, according to Andreessen, it must embrace the new default of driving innovation through software. So software is really important, but every single English journalist news article since then, everyone has said this afterward, right? It's an unoriginal title. Obviously, it's derivative, but there's no denying how far we have come in the 40 years since Richard Stallman created the GNU project. The media and the entire tech industry, it recognizes the advancements in and the predominance of free and open source software. That predominance is super evident if you just look around. It doesn't take much to notice just how important free and open source software is to our world today. So there are some strong open source or closed source contenders for operating system, but there's no sense denying that Linux is usually the default operating system for many purposes. You've got servers, you've got cars, heck, you've got toasters, right? You can find Linux in everything. But it's not just Linux. I mean, I may be using a Mac up here, but we all know, or we're about to learn, that it's just BSD under the covers, right? Free and open source operating systems, they form the foundation on which many of our tools are based. We have one. Now, there are proprietary programming languages. Believe it or not, they do exist. If you look around, MATLAB is the one that comes up most often when people talk about proprietary programming languages. But when you think about the ones that you actually know, the ones that you use, the one that you read articles about, they're all open source. Perl, Python, Ruby, R, Rust, Erlang, Scala, JavaScript, I could go on all day. These are all open source languages, and each one of them has huge ecosystems built around them. In 2014, Apple released a new language, Swift, intended for mobile development and desktop development. It only took them a year of Swift being out there to figure out that they weren't going to get a lot of adoption if it wasn't an open source language. So they did. They open sourced Swift, and now it's gaining a huge amount of momentum. This programming language, originally intended for putting apps on my iPhone and on my MacBook, it's now finding a very, very comfortable home on the server, and that server is running Linux. Anecdata show that proprietary languages, they just can't succeed in the current programming and technical environment. We have one. According to the website builtwith.com, 53% of all websites use WordPress. That's 53%. This little piece of software that Matt Mullenweg whipped together back in 2003 so he could blog more easily, that thing now runs more than 50% of the World Wide Web. Storefronts, webcomics, home pages, photo albums, portfolios, these are all running on free software. And it's only one of the free and open source CMSs that are out there. If you add in Drupal and Joomla, you get another 7%. That's 60% of the entire World Wide Web running on free and open source software. Now, if you add in the others, we haven't even gotten to them yet, like Apache CQ or Plone. We have a landslide win for free and open source software for CMS. As with operating systems, there are some pretty strong contenders in the proprietary space for database. You have SQL Server, you have your Oracle. But for many purposes, open source databases are definitely the way to go. According to dbengines.com, 6 out of the top 10 databases out there are free and open source software. MySQL, Postgres, Mongo, Redis, Elasticsearch, Cassandra. The other 4 members of the top 10 are Oracle, SQL Server, DB2, and Microsoft Access. Oracle still holds the top slot, but by the barest of margins from MySQL. So if you're in a tech company these days, odds are pretty good you're not going to open up your wallet and go to Oracle and say, give me a database. You're more likely to go and download Postgres, download MariaDB, download MySQL. We have one. In 2001, Kerala, India became the very first government to declare it's switching to free and open source software solutions. Thank you, Kerala, for leading the way. Since then, governments like Australia, Malaysia, Brazil, and even the United States, we have all implemented or started programs that are switching to using at least some free and open source software solutions. The UK government's Technology Code of Practice, the thing by which all tech must operate within the UK, it decrees that free and open source solutions must be considered, not should, must be considered, and that open standards must be used in development, and that all new code must be open by default, so it's available for use not only internally within the government, but externally as well. Free and open source software, we are winning government. But the thing that really makes my heart go pitter-patter, the thing that I really love in watching free and open source software evolve, is Microsoft embracing open source software. There are those of us who are still biased against Microsoft, and it's kind of understandable that we're still carrying some baggage considering how Microsoft behaved back in the 90s and early 2000s, right? They do have rather a history with free and open source software, and it's not always a happy one. And yes, I will be the very first one to agree that Microsoft has a long way to go before we can consider it an open source company. But the changes that they're making now, they're real, they're sincere. I mean, they just bought GitHub, and they didn't do that purely for business reasons. They legitimately do care about free and open source software now. It's kind of amazing seeing the transformation in Microsoft of all these companies out there, right? I love seeing how it's evolved. I can't wait to see what it's going to bring us in the future. If free and open source software works for them, if it works for Microsoft, it can work for everyone. That's really encouraging, and that's further proof that, yeah, we have won. We've gained momentum, we've gained mind share, we've done it. Free and open source software has finally and truly arrived, and this is what winning looks like. Congratulations, everyone. Great work. We have shipped free and open source software 3.0. Hey, we've evolved from this niche and mission-driven movement to become the foundation of software development and technology. We've shipped version 3.0 of free and open source software, and it includes all of those features that I just listed. But that's not all that it includes. Version 3.0 is the free and open source software where we see a dramatic increase in corporate involvement in free and open source. And what you see is some JSON showing the contributions by corporations to GitHub in 2000 and I believe it was 16. Version 3.0 is also where we see a dramatic increase in corporate sponsorship of projects, of conferences like this one. We're also seeing a very large uptick in corporate membership in free and open source foundations. Corporations are open sourcing more internal projects every single day. There's a flood of new projects coming out there. Some of them are really large things, like Netflix's Simian Army suite of chaos tools. Really great stuff. If you haven't seen it, they're doing some very interesting work with Simian Army. But there's also just a host of smaller, useful tools that are coming out of corporations now. Overall, these are great. These are amazing. I'm all for it. I am there for this free and open source 3.0. I love watching this happen. Part of the benefit of version 3 of free and open source software is a broader and increased support and adoption for free and open source everywhere. But, and I say this as somebody who helps companies understand, use, and contribute to free and open source software, there are still a lot of them out there that just don't get it. They're participating, maybe they are, but they're kind of going through the motions without really understanding what they're doing, or why, or the importance of it. And this can lead to a lot of problems for the greater free and open source software community. For instance, we get open source, where the source is available, but it's not under an OSI-approved license. So one of the roles that we perform for the entire open source community as the OSI, as the open source initiative, is we review software licenses. We take that license and we compare it to the canonical definition of what it means to be open source, the open source definition with all capital letters. You can find it at opensource.org. We compare the license to the open source definition. And if that license does not match the open source definition, if it does not provide the freedoms and the abilities that are enshrined in the open source definition, then it is not an open source license by definition, and we will not approve it. So therefore, only OSI-approved licenses are those that are guaranteed to provide open source freedoms. Proprietary licenses, company, project, implementation specific, any license you have to pay for, these are typically not going to be open source. They don't provide the four freedoms, they're otherwise limiting. So this is what we call FOPEN source, or potentially just source available, when there is no license at all, which, by the way, you shouldn't do. That's legally, yeah. Don't use software that doesn't have a license. Another problem, we see companies just throw a tarball over the wall. They take their software, they put it out there, And they call it open source because it's available. It may even have an OSI-approved license, but it's essentially just the company taking out their trash. They have thrown this software onto a scrap heap. They will provide no support, they'll provide no participation, no collaboration, only code. They're just getting it out of sight, out of mind. We don't want this in our source control anymore. We'll release it as open source. That can be a good thing, but it isn't really to the spirit of free and open source software. It's not companies that understand what free and open source is all about. Another problem, often companies will use a project, but they won't know that to be a really good citizen, they must contribute back in some way. Of course, this has always been a bit of a problem. It's often called freeloading, but I think that's really way too loaded and negative of a term, so I do avoid it, and I encourage you to do the same. So we need contributors to free and open source software, yes, absolutely, but we also need users. Right? Because those users provide feedback, and most importantly, they provide legitimacy to the project. Someone is using my project, yay! Right? You don't necessarily have to have contributors to get that legitimacy. You just need users. But in general, not contributing, it can be okay, but there does come a point where it's simply taking advantage of a community, intentionally or not, is not a good thing. And a lot of companies are doing this right now. And that last bit is important, intentionally or not. Usually, these problems, they're not malicious. Sometimes companies don't do these things just because they're lazy, but more often they just don't know any better. I've been in this industry for over 20 years now. I've been working with and studying free and open source software for even longer than that. And in my experience, it's very, very rare that companies are malicious when they engage in all of those worst practices that I just listed off. Usually it's just due to ignorance. That's all. And that's because they don't know what's going on here. Businesses know how to business in the way they're used to businessing. This is known territory for them. They know how to do this. They understand the rules, and they're usually pretty good at playing this game. But free and open source, they don't know this very well. They don't know how to do this. It's completely foreign to them. These corporations, they're in completely uncharted waters here. In business speak, we often call these uncharted waters, we call them an emerging market. And free and open source software is an emerging market for most companies. They don't speak the language, they don't understand the customer needs, they don't understand the culture, so they enter the market and then they fall flat on their face because they don't know what they're doing yet. So here's where we, all of us beautiful people, here's where we come in. If we want to continue to grow the number of people participating in free and open source software, and if we want to continue to grow the number of people who understand free and open source software, but not just understand, but the number of people who truly believe in the missions of free and open source software, then we need to take the initiative here, and we need to help our new community members, these companies, these corporations, these governments. We need to help them learn. They're here. They're here in free and open source software, right? They have shipped with version 3.0. They're going to be involved. There's no going back. There's only going forward. So we need to help them do it properly. A lot of people, when I talk to them about this, they think we're selling out. No, we have forgotten the mission of free and open source software. We can't have corporations helping us. We can't have that. But I'm sorry. We can, and we will, and we do, and we're doing great so far. But we can do better, right? The companies are here already. They're not leaving. You can't ask these companies that are built upon free and open source software and employ tens and hundreds of thousands of people. You can't ask them to support the projects on which they rely and then turn on them when they do that. You can't ask companies to sponsor things like this or to sponsor projects and then cry sellouts when someone takes that money. And you can't ask for a livable wage for free and open source software maintainers and then get angry when the money comes from corporations. But unfortunately, I've heard so many people talk about that and do that and complain and say, no, we're selling out because corporations. But you know, this is part of our job. We're here to share the ideals of free and open source software. This is part of what winning looks like. It's to spread those ideals even to people you wouldn't have expected to when you first learned about them. So what can we do to help, right? I mentioned earlier this is where we came in, and so what do I actually mean by that? Well, if free and open source software, if it's a new and unexplored country for businesses, if it is a country, then I hereby nominate all of us in this room as ambassadors. We are ambassadors for free and open source software. If you see companies doing something that is not the free and open source way, don't assume malice. We can't assume malice. But we must assume ignorance, therefore. Ignorance is fixable, and we can all help with that. Now, this is a relationship. We've got free and open source software, and we've got these companies who are here and trying really hard to participate and not really understanding what they're doing. In any relationship, there's going to be two sides to it. So we can step up and we can do our part and communicate on our side of free and open source software. In order to do that, we have to meet companies halfway, if not more. They may not know that they need help. So it's up to us to gently guide them along that path. Teach them what it means to be a good free and open source citizen, but more importantly, teach them why they should be a free and open source citizen. In order to do this, we may have to learn to speak their language. We may need to learn their culture. We may need to learn their needs, because this will be the best way that we can communicate to them. We know now that we can reach out to them, but they may not know they need to reach out to us. So the burden is on us to do this. We need to help them cooperate with free and open source projects. If we want to further the philosophy and the ideology of free and open source software, we have to help these businesses so they can become better community members. Don't wait for them to reach out to you. Take the initiative. Which means if you're a member of a free and open source software community and you hear a company is using your project, just reach out to them and say, hey, how you doing? Do you need any help? Do you have any needs? Can we answer any questions for you? That's really all it takes to get the ball rolling and let them start to learn what community and free and open source software is all about. It may feel like a lot of work having to take that first step rather than waiting for them. But if we do, each of us, just a tiny little bit, then it aggregates very quickly. And the benefits for free and open source software can be amazing. So please, do your part. Help these newest members, these people, these companies who are just like us and want to be a part of free and open source software, help them learn how to navigate our waters. These slides are already available here at Internet Archive. Thank you.